If you're following along, if you're following along in the study guide, we've talked about his early childhood, of course, a very turbulent childhood in many respects, and the death of his mother when he's only 9 years old. Then he's shipped off to a boarding school in a foreign country. You know, he is born in Northern Ireland, but he's sent to a boarding school in England, and all that he has to endure there. And then we talked about, of course, not only his early education process, but also um, uh, when he's 14 years old, he then goes to live with his father's tutor from decades earlier, William Kirkpatrick, the Great Knock. And this is somebody who takes educating children extremely seriously. And he knows that he has a young boy here, young man, who's extraordinarily bright. And so the standards in the bar is very, very high. And he won't allow young Lewis any leeway in terms of the way he thinks and speaks. Everything that Lewis says he believes, or any comments that he makes, has to be defended. And so what William Kirkpatrick is striving to do is to turn this young Lewis into a very rational thinker. And so history is emphasized, philosophy is emphasized, and of course it's a wider curriculum than that. But anyway, Lewis later in life talks about how Kirkpatrick was just so rigid in his expectations and demands, and yet it really trained his mind, formed his mind to be a very rational, logical thinker and a defender of what he thinks and says and all. So it's really an exceptional education. Now, it's also during this period, though, that based in part on his home life back in Northern Ireland, he loses any interest whatsoever in Christianity. And so, as you see there on page 8, he refers to himself in his autobiography years later as a blaspheming atheist, and someone who, you might recall, had prayed for his mother to be healed. And when she was not healed, as he put it, the thing didn't work. And so, I've prayed very earnestly and honestly for her healing, but she died anyway. So, you know, either there isn't a God or he isn't very likable. Okay, he isn't good. So that seems to be his attitude for quite a few years. We on page 9 there, you see in your study guide, Encountering William Kirkpatrick, the Great Knock. Page 10, Eugene Genovese on the value of academic debate in college. And then last week, we were talking about he enrolls in the university. He's so brilliant that he's accepted into Oxford University, the premier university in England. He serves in the trenches in World War I. You remember that on one occasion, he's standing talking to a friend, and a shell explodes and blows that other person to bits. Lewis is also injured, but it's one of those injuries that back in those days, they would say that many soldiers would pray to have an injury like that, because yeah, you're taken out of the front lines, out of service, sent back home to England, but it's not life-threatening. And so in retrospect, he really sees it as, frankly, a manifestation of God's grace. At least years later, he looks at it that way. So anyway, that's page 11, War and Mrs. Moore, Life in the Trenches. And so I'd like to begin there on page 11 of your study guide with a huge and complex episode, as Lewis termed this relationship with Mrs. Moore years later. Now, remember who she is. She's the mother of a good friend that he met uh, as he was being trained for active duty in the English military. And he and that friend agreed that if either of them was killed in the war, then the other one would be sure to look after their parent. And so Lewis takes that very seriously, perhaps too seriously, as we'll talk about. But that's the situation. That friend of his, Patty Moore, is in fact killed in the war. And so we'll sort of start at this point. Now, Lewis is convalescing in a hospital there in the London area. And he's visited almost daily by his friend Patty Moore's mother, which he called Minto. And so just about every day she shows up to attend to his needs. Now, uh, inexplicably and frankly, inexcusably, Lewis's father, Albert, never visited his son after he came back from France, came back, wounded from France. Nor did he ever even visit him in the hospital while he was convalescing. So his father never takes the time and effort to come over from Northern Ireland, but Mrs. Moore is there just about every day. Now, um, they are notified of her son's death, killed in France, and this begins a 30-year-long relationship between Lewis and Mrs. Moore, Janice Moore, but again, nickname is Minto Moore. And so for the first several years, they lived together along with her daughter, Maureen. And so, but after that, they're mostly just living together. But then a few years after that, Lewis's brother, Warney, will start living with them as well, as he needs constant care. He has become a serious alcoholic. And so for most all of his adult life, he needs to live with Lewis and have his needs attended to. Now, Mrs. Moore is oftentimes regarded as a woman who was very, very bright intellectually. So you know that Lewis would have been attracted to that. She's also very unconventional. She's described as being very uninhibited, very spontaneous, very gregarious. Most people who knew her apparently liked her. Her main virtue was hospitality. And so when Lewis is in the hospital there, recovering from his war wounds, she's very, very attentive and all. So she's one of those people that really enjoys, helping, ministering, frankly, to people in that condition. And especially in the early years when they were living together, their home was oftentimes very lively and full of a lot of interesting guests. So she was an interesting person. And of course, Lewis is also a very interesting fellow as well. Now, in his autobiography, Lewis refers to their relationship, though, as, quote, a huge and complex episode. So you can interpret that any way your imagination allows. But otherwise, he absolutely refuses to address their relationship, even with very close friends. And so this is definitely a private life that he's carrying on. Now, some biographers believe that they were lovers, even though she's 26 years older. And by the way, she's not only 26 years older, she's also still legally married. She never actually got a divorce, okay? So one C.S. Lewis scholar puts it this way: as a 20-year-old demobilized war veteran, Jack Lewis began living with a woman 25 years his senior, starting at least partly as a sexual liaison. Lewis's 30-year menage with the witty, dominating, thoroughly anti-religious Janie Moore evolved into something more closely resembling a curious mother-son relationship. Okay, So actually, we don't know that their relationship was sexual. Uh, a lot of C.S. Lewis critics, of course, would be very quick to say, "Oh yeah, that's the case." And in the last 20 years or so, even a lot of first-rate C.S. Lewis scholars who admire C.S. Lewis have conceded, well, it could have been a sexual relationship. In fact, uh, uh, one of his best known biographers says that the odds were about 50-50, perhaps, that this relationship was sexual, or at least that it started out sexual. A.N. Wilson, who's a very renowned biographer. He's written biographies of Tolstoy and Gandhi and a lot of major figures. A.N. Wilson wrote, neither Lewis nor Mrs. Moore were bound by any code of morality. Neither were Christians, nor were they bound by any code of morality, which would have forbidden them to become lovers in the fullest sense. Now, by the way, this biographer A.N. Wilson, I don't know if any of you are familiar with him. He's quite well known. Again, it's written about, a lot of very, very famous people. Wilson was an agnostic for much of his life, but about 10 or 15 years ago, Wilson actually became a professing Christian. Okay. And so it's not like he's hostile or wants to denigrate the memory of C.S. Lewis or anything like that. But based on his resources, that's basically what he concludes. Neither of them were Christians, and so on. Now, in his later years, in his autobiography, C.S. Lewis admitted that when he first came to Oxford University, quote, I was as nearly without a moral conscience as a boy could be. He says, of chastity, I thought as a baboon thinks of classical music, which is probably not very high, if I'm, if I'm interpreting that correctly. So anyway, something to think about. Now, some who knew Lewis best believe that he was drawn to Mrs. Moore because he had never had any kind of normal relationship with a girl or a woman. And she served as kind of a surrogate mother. And some believe, like I said, some C.S. Lewis scholars believe that their relationship was probably strictly platonic, but others think not. Interestingly, he referred to Mrs. Moore as, quote, mother, or sometimes he called her, quote, Minto, and she often referred to him as Boise. One biographer, Christopher Derrick, writes that some biographers see a carnal relationship where the records suggest only dependence upon, Mrs. Moore as being kind of a mother substitute and so on. Now, one of the best biographies of C.S. Lewis is written by George Sayer. Excellent biography, a Christian, somebody who actually knew Lewis very well back in the 30s and 40s, and is certainly an admirer of Lewis. And this is what George Sayer says. He says, Mrs. Moore was a warm and generous mother figure. Because Jack, an unusually sensitive person, had lost his mother at a vulnerable age, 9 years old, and this had been followed at once by banishment to an exceptionally brutal boarding school in England. We talked about that. He felt the lack of mother love as a psychological insecurity. Mrs. Moore, a homely woman, not sure what that means, anyway, a homely woman, and like his mother from Southern Ireland, seemed fit to act as another mother and to provide the love and security that he wanted. As for Mrs. Moore, it was entirely in character that she would have devoted herself to looking after this poor young man who had lost his mother. She was generous, she was very hospitable to a fault, and made a lifelong habit of caring for anyone in need. No doubt Jack responded with love and even adoration. Were they lovers? Well, Owen Barfield, one of Lewis's closest friends throughout most of his life, who knew Jack well in the 1920s, once said that he
Jeffrey, this is Kit. You're muted again.
Thank you, Kit. Have I been muted for a minute or two?
I don't think long.
Okay. Well, thank you for letting me know. I don't know how that happened. So we're talking about, again, Lewis's relationship with Mrs. Moore. And Lewis once confided to a man a close friend who later became one of his biographers, George Sayer, that, quote, Minto was generous and taught me to be generous also. If it were not for her, he says, I should know very little or nothing about ordinary domestic life as lived by most people. So here's somebody who grows up without a mother. He never has a, quote, normal relationship with any female or anything. And so, we'll leave it to the psychologists and psychiatrists to take it from there. In his 2013 biography of Lewis, Alistair McGrath, many of you are familiar with Alistair McGrath, great Christian apologist and all English. Alistair McGrath attempted to make sense of this, quote, huge and complex episode. And McGrath puts it this way. So what was going on between Lewis and Mrs. Moore? We don't have any documents, including records of personal testimony, which allow us to reach reliable conclusions. Because late in her life, Mrs. Moore destroyed all her letters from Lewis. We do, however, understand something of the context against which this relationship developed. We know that Lewis had lost his mother and thus needed maternal affection and understanding at a difficult time in his life when he was away from home and friends. Furthermore, he was preparing to go off to war, facing possible death. Studies of the Great War, World War I, emphasize its subservient impact on British social and moral conventions around that time. Young men were about to go to the front, and they were subject to great sympathy from women because, a lot of these young men probably weren't going to come back alive. And this sympathy that they received from other young women often led to passionate yet generally ephemeral affairs. Lewis, as his letters to his friend Arthur Greaves indicate, was a very sexually inquisitive young man. We are perfectly entitled to wonder what Mrs. Moore was doing in Lewis's rooms at University College before he went off to join the military, a memory that Lewis had so clearly cherished to judge by his diary entries. What can now be said with some confidence is that the circumstantial evidence suggests that Lewis developed a complex relationship with Mrs. Moore in the summer of 1917. George Sayer, a close friend of Lewis's, who is widely regarded as one of its most insightful biographers, initially regarded their relationship as ambivalent, but ultimately platonic. Older studies sympathetic to Lewis considered and rejected the possibility that Lewis and Mrs. Moore were lovers. Yet the tide of opinion has changed. Even George Sayer, again, a great admirer and friend of Lewis, even George Sayer himself represents this shifting consensus. In a revised introduction to later editions of his work, written in 1996, Sayer stated that he was now, quote, quite certain that Lewis and Mrs. Moore had been lovers, and furthermore argued that this development was, quote, not surprising given Lewis's deep, unresolved emotional needs and the conflicts he was facing at the time. Yet their relationship cannot really be described as merely sexual. Rather, it appears to have been strongly shaped by both maternal and romantic factors. What's difficult to understand is perhaps not why such a relationship developed, but why this relationship continued for so long afterwards. And he goes on to say, keep in mind that Lewis had no Christian beliefs at this stage in his life and clearly regarded himself as free to establish such values and practices as he saw fit. Okay. And so that, as we know, I mean, that is the great appeal of atheism is you get to be your own God, the master of your own soul, or at least you get to pretend that you are. Okay. So you can live your life however you please. So, however, having said all that, from the outset of this relationship, neither his father nor his brother approved of the relationship, and Lewis did his best to conceal the extent of this relationship from both his brother and his father. In a letter to his father in 1919, Warney, Lewis's brother, complained that, quote, the whole thing irritates me by its freakishness. In other words, I'm very uncomfortable with this relationship my brother has with this woman who could be his mother. Albert Lewis was particularly concerned that Mrs. Moore was separated from her husband. As I said, she wasn't even divorced at this time, whom he had heard was a total scoundrel, and that this might complicate Jack's life and career. And in fact, Warney, throughout his life, never really warmed up to Mrs. Moore. And in his memoirs, he characterized her as selfish, domineering, possessive, and he referred to his brother Jack as her servant. So anyway, it's one of those scenarios that I'm sure we're all very thankful we never experienced. We didn't know either one of them at the time. And better that than otherwise. Yes, Allie.
I have a question.
Sure.
You were just about to, if you could go back, say what Sheldon Van Auken said. That got interrupted by the music.
Oh,
just
Sheldon Van Auken's comment.
Yeah.
And again, he's very well regarded as one of the top Lewis, experts in the world and that sort of thing. Van Auken wrote, was there a sexual relationship? We cannot know. But if there was, is it not odd that Jack always called her mother and introduced her as mother? What Mrs. Moore gave him was what he needed most, a mother, family warmth, and a home. Okay, so anyway. Well, they actually lived together for about 30 to 33 years before she died. So this started around 1920 or 1919, as soon as he came back from the front, wounded. And it continued until she died. I believe she died about 1952 or so. So about 32, 33 years. It was, yeah, his conversion was around 1930. Okay. So for at least 10 years, he was not a Christian during this time he was living with her and so on. Anyway, interesting aside, and fortunately, there's more to talk about that's considerably more important, especially in terms of his spiritual life and the millions of lives that he later influenced as a result. But again, a huge and complex episode. So having said that, let's move on, okay? Yeah, I've never read anything that implied that he ever met her husband. She described her husband as a total creep, basically. And so I'm sure Lewis probably had absolutely no interest in ever meeting her husband. Yeah, but I'm not totally positive about that.
They never officially got a divorce, have you?
Not that I'm aware of. I've never read anything that indicated that Mrs. Moore finalized any kind of divorce or anything. So,
But this is interesting, because he never married until he met Floyd,
Mhm.
very, and after Mrs. Moore died,
mhm.
and he was very nice looking man. So many of the young men, were killed.
Yeah,
So there was a shortage of men.
yes, yeah.
Wonder, I mean, and apparently she did have a domineering personality, maybe controlling.
Yeah, that seems to have been the case the older she got. Early on, she's described as very vivacious and engaging, and a lot of people just like her, and she attracted interesting people to their home and so on. But as she gets older, she becomes less secure and Yeah.
How would Floyd know that his lady lived with him?
did who know?
When he became famous.
Probably not. Probably not. Um, yeah, I would doubt it. In other words, his colleagues at Oxford and later at Cambridge, his colleagues hardly knew anything about his private life, and he certainly kept it that way. And imagine, if this relationship were purely platonic, still it could be a source of great scandal and embarrassment. So you can understand why he wouldn't want, even casual friends or colleagues to know about it.
Yeah, and maybe calling her mother was kind of like, tricky. I mean, to keep it
Yeah.
looking a certain way. I don't know.
Yeah,
That's-
yeah. Well, the implication certainly is, certainly nobody would suspect anything beyond just a platonic relationship. If you're going to be calling this older woman mother. So.
And I whispered to Philip, well, you might know better if we could see a picture of her 46-year-old.
And one said she was homely and one said she was handsome.
Yeah,
so-
that's right. Yeah, yeah. Which are typically, neither one of those are terms that we typically use for women these days. You're very homely. And someone else will say, no, she's handsome. No, I don't know. Again, I'm not sure, but I've never read anything that his father ever came to visit. I'm sure his father would not have wanted to come and visit with his son living with a woman old enough to be, his mother and all. So Lewis, over the years, would go back to Northern Ireland and, visit his father and so on. But I'm not aware that his father ever actually came, to Oxford. So if you have the opportunity, and of course, we had to postpone our C.S. Lewis tour, but hopefully we can do that, later this year or next year or something like that. And you'll enjoy going to the Kilns, the home of C.S. Lewis, where he lived most of his life with Mrs. Moore and with Warney, and so on. And it's really, really an interesting little cottage, I'd say. All right, well, let's move on here in your notes to the section there that says the academic life. This is page 12 in the study guide. And we'll look at this person who I describe as a budding intellectual. Now, Lewis returned to University College in January of 1919. That's the college associated with Oxford University, where he had attended shortly before he joined the military during World War I. And so he gets back to University College in January 1919 after he's recovered from his wounds, and immediately he embarks upon an academic career. He's an absolutely startling student. He earns two degrees, one in Greek and Latin texts and the other in classical philosophy. And he finished first in his class in both of those areas of study. After he completes his program, he finds that faculty positions are very rare, especially in philosophy. And so he returns as a student once more and earns a third degree. And this was in English language and literature. And once again, he is number one in his class. So the young man is just absolutely phenomenally brilliant. The deeper that he delved into this third field, and that is English language and literature, he got more and more engaged with poetry. And the more he studied poetry, the more he appreciated the value of poetry. Now, it seems very, very quaint to us, because we've all grown up in an age in which popular music is just absolutely dominant. Okay, but before, perhaps the turn of the 1940s or whatever, poetry was a major source of entertainment. And you'd have college students and all going to poetry readings, in university cities and elsewhere. And so it was probably the most influential pop culture phenomenon before popular music became that. So the more he delves into literature and poetry, as I said, the more he appreciates their value. He believes that human life is best understood not just through the intellect, through philosophy and rational thinking, but also through the imagination. And he came to believe that poets and novelists have as much to teach us as do philosophers. Again, considering the state of popular culture and the state of poetry later in the 20th century and into our present times, that's a little bit hard to imagine. But he was just really transfixed by it. Now, there's a great Christian scholar and academic by the name of Charles Malik. And Charles Malik, who used to write for Christianity Today magazine on a regular basis and just had very, very keen insights. Charles Malik's advice that he wrote to young Christians in a 1980 article in Christianity Today that I happened to come across, I just found extremely interesting, because Malik is, again, he's addressing college-age young Christians on the value of liberal education, in other words, broad education. And he writes this, quote, "The mind in its greatest and deepest reaches is not cared for enough." In other words, we don't spend enough time developing our mind. But intellectual nurture, he says, cannot take place apart from profound immersion over a period of years in the history of thought and the history of the spirit. People who, and this again, see, he's writing primarily to college students. He says, people who are in a hurry to get out of the university and start earning money or serving the church or preaching the gospel have no idea of the infinite value of spending years and years of leisure conversing with the greatest minds and souls of the past, ripening and sharpening and enlarging their powers of thinking. The result is that the arena of creative thinking is vacated and abdicated to the enemy. Now, this is so countercultural, isn't it? I mean, we all think, okay, all right, graduated from high school, I need to go to college, and get a degree and so on, but we want to rush through and then get on and start engaging, quote, the real world and making money and all. And oftentimes that's by absolute necessity. But nonetheless, I think Malik's advice here is really interesting. And that is, in an ideal situation, we would spend years and years studying philosophy and great literature and history and so on. And then eventually we can fulfill our true potential in life. And, we always think, well, gee, Jesus Christ did not begin his ministry till he was 30 years old. And yet, the trend is to rush through college or rush through seminary or whatever, and then, begin ministry just as soon as possible. So anyway, for what it's worth, I've always found those remarks by Charles Malik to be very, very thought-provoking. And of course, learning can also be a lifelong endeavor. And so over the years, we've had hundreds and thousands, really serious adults, oftentimes older adults, involved in our classes and everything. And it's very, very inspiring to encounter people who are, as we oftentimes say, lifelong learners. Very, very impressive.
But it seems the university changed.
Oh, yes.
This
Go.
is not the university today of what he's writing up.
Yeah. Well, and how would you, Millie, how would you explain how the universities have changed since the early 1900s? In other words, a century ago.
Just all the DEI and just the infiltration of the march through the universities, like that we, the social changes and all that's happened.
Yeah.
Since the 60s.
Right.
Yeah.
And it just seems, from what I understand, my knowledge is not expansive on that, but these children are not being taught in curriculum that they're learning, and what Jennifer's and Betty's daughter experienced in the art class last year.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. It's been basically taken captive by the left, by neo-Marxists, but pardon me?
Progressives.
Yeah, so-called
progressives.
progressives.
They had a real agenda.
But
All written.
see, other than that, it's so much emphasis on business and making money when you get out and that sort of thing. And so in the past, a college degree almost always required a study of philosophy to some extent, and a study of history to some extent, and so on. But that was all eliminated, of course, in the late 60s and early 1970s. So many of the elite universities and colleges eliminated any core curriculum. And so you can go off to school and just, if you're interested in, I don't know, pharmacology or whatever, you can almost exclusively, study that field and no encounter with the social sciences whatsoever.
I think,
Mhm.
especially in the 80s, that's when I was in college, the philosophy or literature or those were denigrated. And what are you going to do with that?
Yeah,
How are you going to make money studying
Right.
that?
right.
So, like I said, I think the focus at that point, sure, there was a lot of liberal, but it was more get your degree so you can get out and make money. not
Yes.
To expand your mind and to learn.
Yeah, it's more practical. And, we do have to survive, don't we? And so, but it is a totally, and of course, college education going back a century, 2 centuries, 3 centuries was really education for the elite in society. And so these were young men and to some extent women who could spend years and years, and their needs were always covered by their affluent, families and so on. So yeah, it's considerably more complex than we'd like to imagine. All right, now, Lewis, in his studies here after World War I, has become just absolutely enthralled with the world of poetry. And in fact, it sounds like he thinks that poetry is every bit or maybe more important or valuable, I guess you'd say, than philosophy is. And so he becomes basically an aspiring poet. And he publishes a book in 1919 called Spirits in Bondage. And this is a collection of war poems. And he published the book under a pseudonym, Clive Hamilton. I guess, you know, as a budding academic, he didn't want to assign his true name to it for fear that it wouldn't be well received or that his academic colleagues would look down on him for, you know, what are you doing writing a, you know, book about poetry when you want to be a, you know, philosophy professor or something like that. So the theme of this is that human beings are alone in a totally pitiless universe. Now, what philosophy does that remind you of? Nihilism. And that's what he absolutely believes at this point in his life. And it's easy to imagine why, you know, looking at what we said about his life up to this point. In other words, his view here is that nature is violent, nature is malevolent, and if there is a God at all, this God is very distant, and this God is totally indifferent. Apparently, he couldn't care less if we suffer in this life. So some of these poems in this book, and I had never opened and read this book until about 10 years ago, it's a lot of the poems that he wrote in this book are absolutely blasphemous. One poem, he refers to a phantom called the good. In other words, a phantom that we would associate with God. Well, a phantom, you know, it's just a mystical, you know, imaginative figure. But here's a one poem that I wanted to mention. And this is a poem called De Profundis. And he expresses an outright contempt for an unjust and uncaring God who's created a world that's full of just terrible pain and suffering. And of course, he's seen plenty of it in the trenches in World War I. And so I'll quote a few lines here from this particular poem. Lewis writes, quote, come and let us curse our master with a capital M, ere we die. For all our hopes in endless ruin lie. He goes on to say, the good is dead. Let us curse God Most High. Okay. So again, he's seen just unbelievable horror on the battlefield, the greatest war in all of human history up to that time. He goes on to say in a subsequent verse, 4,000 years, FOUR, 4,000 years of toil and hope and thought. Now, 4,000 years, what's that take us back to? Pretty much the dawn of civilization. Okay. So 4,000 years of toil and hope and thought. We built us joyful cities, strong and fair. Knowledge we sought and gathered wisdom rare. And all this time you laughed upon our care, you being God, if there is a God. Okay. Then he goes on in a subsequent verse to talk about, come then and curse the Lord. Over the earth, gross darkness falls, and evil was our birth. And our few happy days are of little worth. And then one line from a subsequent verse, yet I will not bow down to thee nor love thee. Again, referring to God, if there is, in fact, a God. And so this is not all that unusual to see verse like this coming from those who had suffered through World War One. And in fact, at this point in his life, Lewis actually was not apparently a totally convinced atheist. And the yeah, well, remember I mentioned last week or the week before a comment that he made that he didn't believe in, now this is when he was a few years younger, that he didn't believe in God, and he was very angry that there wasn't a God, okay? Because this life means nothing. It's just a pit of sorrow and despair. But now he's gone through World War One, so he believes that, you know, all the more intensely. So actually, when you read through this particular poem I was citing, it sounds like he's more agnostic than atheistic, actually, but also it brings up what we call Manichaeism, the ancient philosophy of Manichaeism, which is this idea, it's a dualistic idea that there's a great God of good and a God of evil. And apparently they have more or less equal power, because you look at the world and you see people doing a lot of things that are good and noble and decent and so on. And then you also see people that are just absolutely despicable. And oftentimes the despicable people are the ones who are flourishing in this life, you know, overpowering everybody else. So this is basically Manichaeism, a God of good and a God of evil. And that seems to be what he's dealing with in this particular poem. Anyway, he publishes the book, and it totally fails to sell any copies. And so he's very, very disheartened as a result of that. And so he immediately abandons his ambition to become a great lyric poet. Okay. So he's going to have to get serious about an academic career in philosophy and so on. And that's what he devotes basically the rest of his academic life to. And that takes us to the section there on page 12, Professor Lewis. Any comments?
I was just gonna say, I thought that poem you read was interesting because in a way, it sounds to me like his passion, his anger, and his frustration with God, that's a better sign than absolute apathy. Like, you know, today I'm more hopeful when I see anger, like people who are angry and I don't believe in God and they have a lot of passion, rather than like, well, whatever floats your boat, you know, like you do you, I do me, you know? I almost feel like he was wrestling with God in a way that, this is gonna sound weird, but God may respect that because at least he's wrestling with him.
At least he's dealing with the realities of good and evil, right?
And thinking, not just shelving it or drinking it away or whatever.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's a very good point.
He's thinking.
The worst alternative would be to just drug yourself and, you know, not deal with reality at all. Yeah, that's a very good point you make. Yeah. And where does this idea come from anyway? That, I mean, what's wrong with war and killing and all? I mean, it's just human nature expressing itself, right? So where do we get this idea that certain things are good and evil and right and wrong? I mean, that can't come from nature. If you're a total naturalist, there's no basis at all on which, you know, you would judge that certain things are proper or improper, right or wrong, good or evil. So I think you make a very good point in that regard. Yeah. Okay. So we're moving along a little bit in his life. It's now 1924. He's already finished his third degree, and he's offered a lectureship at University College there. And then the following year, he receives an appointment to the faculty of Magdalen College. Now, Magdalen, that's you understand that the British people, they don't speak English very well. And it's spelled Magdalen, isn't it? But they incorrectly pronounce it Magdalen. So he's appointed to the faculty there and begins his career as a lecturer and a tutor in English literature. Now, he's going to remain there at Magdalen College at Oxford University for 30 years, from about 1925 to 55. And then at that point, he'll actually be offered a full professorship at Magdalen College of Cambridge University. Let's see, Cambridge is how far from Oxford? Maybe 100 miles or so, maybe. And of course, those are the two preeminent, premier universities in all of England. And they both have a Magdalen College. So he teaches at Oxford first and then at Cambridge. Now, one of the first things he does is to sit down and write a letter to his father, whom he rarely ever communicated with. And basically, they'd been estranged for several years. But this is what Lewis writes. First, let me thank you from the bottom of my heart for the generous support extended over 6 years, which alone have enabled me to hang on like this. Thank you again and again. So, he doesn't have an ideal father, does he, to say the least? But at this point, he's realizing that despite all of his father's flaws, his father in his own way actually did love and care for him. And now he has the possibility of a very fruitful and satisfying career in academia. So we're told that as a lecturer, he's very enthusiastic, very engaged, very effective communicator, and his courses become some of the most popular courses on campus at the time. And in addition to preparing these formal lectures, a lot of his time spent in individualized tutorial sessions with students. And these are 1-hour sessions in which students write essays on assigned topics. Now, that was the case for me in my doctoral program. And we'd have these professors, and every week we'd write an essay on a particular topic. Then we'd go in and he would review what we'd written and question and interrogate us and harass us and so on. But anyway, as a lecturer, Lewis is really excellent. He uses the Socratic method to interview these students and really engages them effectively. Many of them had later in life talked about how excellent he was. He was probably their favorite professor, or at least lecturer. And so in typical Socratic fashion, he regularly challenges students to define and explain any terms they're using. Now, where'd you get that from? Well, William Kirkpatrick, okay? You can't say anything without having to explain exactly what it is and the words you used and so on. And in the process, of course, his students learn to defend their position and they mature intellectually. So as a tutor, we're told that Lewis came across as very amiable, very conscientious, very focused. To students who were serious, underlined serious, he was very kind, very patient, very stimulating, very generous. But to those who were slackers and or as was common back then, they were conceited prigs, he could be very, very demanding and intimidating. And he absolutely would not tolerate sloppy thinking and sloppy language. And so he certainly earns a reputation. If you're going to study under this guy, you better take your study seriously, or else he's not going to have any, patience with you. And frankly, that's true education. Now, once a week in the evenings, he would host a beer and Beowulf session for his students. And they'd get together and drink lots of beer and talk about, medieval literature and so on. And at the end of a semester, he would sponsor what he called the English binge. And his biographer, A.N. Wilson, puts it this way. He says, one requirement that Lewis imposed upon his students was a mandatory end of the semester dinner. He called it the English binge. And it was a carryover from his days as an officer cadet during the Great War. Many of his students found it rather inappropriate and embarrassing. because the point of the evening was primarily, first of all, get drunk. And Lewis insisted that the conversation be, quote, bawdy, B-A-W-D-Y, okay? And so it was full of rowdy songs and risque humor and so on. And he must have really enjoyed this. A lot of his students, however, were considerably more ambivalent than that, okay? And you got to pretend like you're enjoying this, in order to pass his classes or whatever. Now, for several years, though, he really flourishes in the intellectual and hedonistic culture there at Oxford University. Although he's intrigued by the works of Christian writers like George MacDonald, like G.K. Chesterton, he's relatively comfortable as an upwardly mobile religious skeptic. Christians back then at Oxford, that'd be the same thing today, were not regarded with respect by academicians and the intelligentsia and all. If you're a Christian, you must not be a very deep thinker, okay, is their position. And his biographer, Walter Hooper, puts it this way, interesting quote. He says, Christian belief was highly discredited among the intellectuals in the 1920s. T.S. Eliot, famous literary figure, was the darling of the Bloomsbury group. That was a loose association of high-level authors and whatever. T.S. Eliot was the darling of the Bloomsbury group until he was baptized and confirmed in the Church of England in 1927. Now, this was shocking behavior for the author of somebody who'd written books like The Wasteland and so on. And one of these intellectuals, Virginia Woolf, wrote at the time to a friend saying, quote, I have had a most shameful and distressing interview with our dear friend Tom Eliot, who may be called dead to us all from this day forward. He's become an Anglo-Catholic believer in God. He also believes in immortality, and he even goes to church. I was shocked, she says. A corpse would seem to me more credible than he is. I mean, there's something absolutely obscene about a living person sitting by the fire and believing in God. Okay, well, that sounds like, that would be the kind of comments you'd hear in a university today. Well, this takes us back a century, and it was a similar mentality at the time. So this is a really very anti-God environment in which he's, living and developing his early career. But gradually over time, Lewis came to enjoy the camaraderie of a few of his comrades, his colleagues, including in particular J.R.R. Tolkien. Those two in particular, Tolkien and Lewis, became close friends, but in the process, Lewis had to overcome a couple of prejudices. One, as he writes, at my first coming into the world, I had been warned never trust a papist. In other words, don't ever believe or trust anything a Catholic says. And Tolkien was a Catholic. And at my first coming into the English faculty, I was told never to trust a philologist. In other words, a philologist, somebody who studies the structure and history and all of language. And he says Tolkien was both a philologist and a Catholic. And yet they developed camaraderie that really serves Lewis very, very well for many years. Now, in 1926, he publishes a work, again under the pseudonym Clyde Hamilton, and this is an epic-length poem about the relationship between fantasy and reality. So Daimer, those of you who are into fantasy literature and poetry and so on, you might find this interesting to check out. It was actually a work in progress for about 10 years, but Lewis hoped that it would establish him as a major poet. It didn't, but nonetheless, he took this work very, very seriously. And although mystical and metaphysical in nature, the poem is also a political commentary. in particular, and this is very interesting. Now, here's somebody who's gone through World War One. He's living in England in the 1920s among high-level academics and so on. And if he has one strong political belief, it is what we might call anti-Marxism. In other words, this work, Timer, is actually a satire on the authoritarian state, the Platonic, going back to Plato and his views on political philosophy and so on. And so, like Aldous Huxley's Brave New World a few years later, Lewis is skeptical of any man-made attempts to create a utopian paradise on Earth, which a lot of atheists, are drawn to that orientation. They're drawn to Marxism and so on. But for Lewis, he believes that any attempt to create a utopian paradise is unfathomable and to be opposed at every level. And so throughout the rest of his academic career, really up until near the time that he dies in the early 1960s, he writes from time to time criticisms of utopian socialism, authoritarian style government. And this is something a lot of people, even those who've read an awful lot of Lewis's works, don't realize. He was, decisively anti-socialist, anti-left. So in this poem, it depicts the perfect city, capital P, capital C, the perfect city, in which Lewis writes, there's no hour that was left uncharted. Love was in a schedule, and the state chose who you would mate with and when. The state wants to control every area of your life. Nature is the enemy of the perfect city, and the hero, Dimer, is actually a rebel against authoritarianism. Now, again, back in the 1920s, socialism and all was, among many academics, the latest rage, Marxism, socialism, and so on. So in this poem, during his pilgrimage through life, Dimer goes through a series of transitional phases. First, he believes that the purpose of life is just to enjoy it to the maximum. So basically, he becomes a hedonist. But that doesn't last long before he realizes that ultimately there's no joy and certainly no sense of fulfillment in a life devoted to hedonism. He next comes to realize that nature is both good and evil. He seeks escape through fantasy and through aesthetics, through the arts, I guess music, poetry, great works of art and so on. But again, that doesn't satisfy. He imagines changing the system in which he's living politically, first by leading a revolution and then by becoming a dictator. But none of that works out, and he retreats into gluttony and excess. He seeks meaning through sex, but the pleasures of the flesh are fleeting and unfulfilling. He discovers that a rebellion in the perfect city is led only to a savage civil war, which all it did was create more misery and more oppression. So he begins sinking into a state of total despair, and he's rescued from existential agony by a kind of a miracle, an experience of joy, which is inexplicable. It's mystical. It's like Lewis experienced, remember, back when he was about 7, 8 years old. And there's just something that sparks his imagination as being beautiful and transcendent to just, dreary day-to-day life in this world. So Dimer experiences that, the reality of joy. And joy produces humility, which allows him to see the world as it really is. And that's a world that's undistorted by fantasy. And in the end, after experiencing a spiritual ascent, the soul ascends, he confronts an evil monster of the night who quickly crushes and kills him. However, his courage in facing the truth sets off a process of cosmic rebirth. Plants begin to blossom, country springs forth with dancing flowers, and Dimer is purified and becomes a god, lowercase g. So in effect, Dimer becomes a kind of Christ figure, but only after he's gone through every variation in life, seeking meaning in life through pleasure and success and so on, and then realizing it's all a dead end. And even the most beautiful music, as Lewis will later write, even the most beautiful music that perhaps can be temporarily enrapturing, but once it's over, it's like, oh, is that it? So you could listen to the complete works of Beethoven for hours and hours. And when it's over, it's like, is that it? Is that all? It doesn't ultimately satisfy, does it? So this is very interesting. He's far from being a Christian at this point, and yet he's writing this poem about Dimer, who's going through all these phases only to find that nothing has any transcendent meaning except for that, intimation of joy that there is an ultimate reality for which we were created to experience. But you don't experience it in this life, apparently. So anyway, this is a poem that created a lot of, generated a lot of critical praise. A lot of people said, wow, there's some really profound insights in this poem. But on the other hand, very few people ever bothered to buy the book. And so at this point, he's tried twice to write poems that would really engage a broad audience. Both times it's not worked out. And so he's going to have to turn his attention once again back to philosophy and his specialties in early literature and so on. All right, so how are we doing for time? We're about, I can hardly see.
Yeah.
It's 1:45, okay. So let me introduce a new topic, and then we'll talk here for a little while. And I noticed there's several comments that have come in via chat as well. So if you look at the next page 13, this really gets us into sort of the heart of what we've been striving toward for several weeks now, a most reluctant convert. Here's somebody who becomes a Christian, as he would say it, very, very reluctantly, only because all the other avenues in life are meaningless. They all end in dead ends. And so the only truth and hope there is in Jesus Christ and faith in Jesus Christ. And I'll just make a few comments here. In his study of literature, Lewis was constantly being exposed to the spiritual dimension of life through the works of great authors like George MacDonald, like G.K. Chesterton and others. He couldn't escape the Christian message. And this is how he puts it, and this is just wonderful to read. He says, all the books were turning against me. In other words, all the interesting books and profound books were turning against me and against my worldview. Indeed, I must have been as blind as a bat not to have seen long before the ludicrous contradiction between my theory of life and my actual experiences as a reader. He says, George MacDonald had done more to me than any other writer. Of course, it was a pity that he had that bee in his bonnet about Christianity, but he was good in spite of it. G.K. Chesterton had more sense than all the other modern writers put together. Even among the ancient authors, the same paradox was to be found. The most religious of them, like Plato, for instance, Aeschylus, Virgil, were clearly those on whom I could really feed. On the other hand, those writers who did not suffer from religion all seemed a little thin. In other words, they're not very deep thinkers. It wasn't that I didn't like them. They were all very entertaining, but they weren't anything other than entertaining. There seemed to be no depth in them. I read G.K. Chesterton's The Everlasting Man, and for the first time, I saw the whole Christian outline of history set out in a form that seemed to me to make sense. He goes on to say, but the most alarming of all was George Herbert. George Herbert was an Anglican priest and a pretty well-known scholar back then and author. He says, here was a man who seemed to me to exceed all the authors I had read in terms of conveying the very quality of life as we actually live it from moment to moment. But the wretched fellow, instead of doing it all directly, insisted on mediating it through what I called the Christian mythology. Now, we'll explain that next week. On the other hand, most of the authors who might be claimed as precursors of modern enlightenment seemed to me to be quite puny by comparison, and frankly, they bored me. He goes on to say, the only non-Christians who seemed to me really to know anything were the Romantics, and a good many of them were tinged with something like religion, even at times with Christianity. I was drawn to this conclusion, that Christians are wrong. He's still not a believer. Christians are wrong, but all the rest are bores. Christians are wrong, he thinks, but all the rest of these people are superficial bores. Okay. So if you're really looking for meaning and truth in life, the only people that seem to have anything to offer are Christians. Christian authors and so on. But he's still biased against traditional Christianity. So we'll pick up at that point next week and take it through to his remarkable conversion experience. All right, let me see what we have here in the chat. The first comment in the chat box is, I think you're muted. Okay, so we resolved that. The second one is we can't hear you. Okay, so we dealt with that one. Thirdly, your audio is muted. Okay, this is getting more and more interesting all the time, and it does constitute a pattern, doesn't it? So my apologies, and if that happens in the future, I don't know how that happened. I didn't push any buttons up here without permission. But if it happens in the future, please let me know as soon as possible, and I'll try to correct that. So anyway, comments or thoughts on what we talked about this evening? Okay.
I think the movie came out several years ago, the Max McClain.
Yes.
Yes, Lewis on his early life.
Mm-hmm.
Would go along quite with what we're studying.
Yeah. Yeah.
It ends pretty abruptly. I think it ends before he becomes a Christian, if I remember correctly.
Was that the movie, The Most Reluctant Convert? Seems like it would have culminated with his conversion, did it not? I don't remember. Really, just barely? Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I don't remember.
The last thing was in church and walked out and saw his own gravestone. So
Really? Was that the last scene? Okay.
This one was done by the guy who had done a one-man show of C.S. Lewis for so long.
Yeah.
Practically knew the
Max
whole
McClain, isn't that his name? Yeah.
started.
Yeah. Yeah. Max McClain. Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, look at the trajectory of his life, and the the turbulent home life, losing his mother, being shipped off to an authoritarian school in England, you know, being laughed at and ridiculed by fellow students because he wasn't an athlete. And you know, wasn't even English, yeah. And then by God's grace, he, you know, his father intervenes and links him up with William Kirkpatrick. Now, it must have been lonely as could be. I mean, it doesn't sound like he had much of any social life at all, but at least this is serious education, and he's being challenged to think clearly and rationally and be able to articulate and defend what he believes. So it's a rocky road, though.
We did say later in life that if he had his choice, he would just back to wherever, live there. But because it was so, it did him so, it did him so much good, and he learned so much that he really look back on that time, extraordinarily fun.
And so by the time he's old enough to enter the university, the person who interviews him says, "This is the most brilliant student I've ever interacted with." So that certainly works to his advantage. Then he goes off and experiences the realities, the darkest realities of human behavior in World War I. A slaughter is all it is. And you can imagine what kind of trauma he suffered from that. And then he gets involved with a woman old enough to be his mother. And we don't know the extent of that relationship, but again, the kind of the bottom line, he's never had a natural, normal relationship with a female, you know. And so he's really struggling in life, and yet, as we close the session, he has a voracious reading appetite, and he comes to the realization eventually the only authors that have anything worthwhile to say, frankly, are Christians. And this is very, very puzzling to him. But please, go ahead.
Say when he was having his relationship, she gave him something that he had never had that he needed badly, which was a mother. She gave him affection.
Yeah.
She taught him what it was to be in a family, in a home.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, good point.
And so good things came out of it. It may not have been the best in the world, but something did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 Well said. So he's despite such a rocky road, he's making progress. And we'll pick up with that next week and talk about, again, this just so inspiring conversion story of his. And, you know, we rarely ever have the opportunity to teach this particular course, and I'm talking about our course on writing your spiritual autobiography. I think it's been quite a few years since we last had the opportunity to offer that, but that really is probably my favorite course to teach, because everybody's testimony is so unique, and seeing how God has worked in everybody's life individually, it's so very, very inspiring. And Lewis, of course, is a perfect example of that. But we all come to faith in Jesus Christ through slightly different, or sometimes radically different means. And yet the end result is the same. And again, I can't imagine anything more glorifying to God and more inspiring to hear. So perhaps we can recycle that class before too much longer.
They're doing the screw tape like letters at Energy Center, I think in March.
Yes.
It's been out on Facebook.
Yes. Yeah, so you might want to check that out.
It's only one show right now.
I checked a month or more ago, and it was only one show. And but maybe they've expanded it. I don't know, but certainly worth seeing if you can afford the tickets. When I checked a month ago, they were $75 a piece, but when you add on all the tax and, handling fees and all, it came out to $99. And, anyway, but, yeah, yeah.
You go to the box office.
Years ago.
Oh, see, I was not aware of that. So you can go to the box office and, okay. Yeah, I was trying to do it through Ticketmaster and it was, finally, we just figured it was prohibitively expensive. So, but anyway, check it out if you're interested. Well, anything else? Those of you joining us online? Any comments, questions, anything? Thank you, Christine. Good to see you all, Janet, and everybody else there.
Yeah, I enjoyed the talk.
Well, thank you. Well, you'll enjoy it more next week because he'll be a Christian by the time our next session is over. So cause for true celebration.
Yay.
Good to see you all. Blessings on the rest of your week. Join us in person if your schedule allows, and but we'll carry on next week.
Okay, let's see, close this.